James adjusted the collar of his new SCP Foundation uniform, still not quite used to the feel of the heavy fabric. The vehicle he rode in rattled along the dirt road, kicking up a thin cloud of dust behind it. The sun had only just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. As Site-22 came into view, James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The air around the remote airstrip was eerily still. The airport was nothing like the bustling civilian terminals James was used to. Instead, it looked more like a relic, an abandoned husk of a place. No loudspeakers, no passengers, no sound at all. Only the occasional gust of wind whistling through the empty terminal windows. Foundation personnel moved with an efficiency that only added to the unease. They all knew their roles, staying within their tight routines, barely acknowledging his arrival. "Welcome to Site-22A," a man in dark fatigues greeted him as the transport vehicle came to a halt. His voice was gruff, his face set in an expression of impatience. "I'm Agent Morgan. I'll be briefing you for the next couple of days. Orientation class begins shortly, but for now we need to get you up to speed on what's happening tomorrow." James stepped out of the vehicle, feeling the heat of the ground seep through his boots. The air smelled dry, faintly tinged with something like burning. His gaze swept over the small, sun-bleached terminal building, its windows reflecting the first light of day. There was something unnerving about how quiet everything was, despite the presence of a dozen or so Foundation personnel setting up equipment near the runway. "Tomorrow?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah," Morgan replied, already walking toward the building. "September 23rd. The arrival flight. You've read the file on SCP-036, right?" James nodded. He had read it, sure. But reading about something so strange and experiencing the reality of it were entirely different things. The file described the arrival of a plane that didn't appear on any commercial records, a group of passengers, pilgrims, that boarded with no explanation, and no trace of where they came from. They were said to be reincarnated Yazidis, undergoing some kind of metaphysical ritual, Kira's Guhoran, which translated to changing garments. It all sounded too strange to believe. Morgan led James inside the terminal, where a group of senior Foundation agents were gathered around a table, reviewing maps and charts. A large screen showed an empty radar display, with the surrounding area highlighted. Despite the high-tech equipment, the terminal felt like it hadn't seen much use. The floors were worn, and the walls, though clean, bore the signs of age. James could feel the weight of history here, but it was a history no one was willing to speak about openly. "The arrival flight usually shows up between 04000 and 0500, Morgan explained as he handed James a small stack of papers. "It's always the same, year after year. The pilgrims arrive, they disembark, and by the afternoon they're gone again, headed to their mysterious pilgrimage flight. You'll help monitor them while they're here. And if you're lucky, you won't remember any of it when it's over." James furrowed his brow. "What do you mean by that?" "These pilgrims," Morgan paused, choosing his words carefully. "They're different. They don't recognize anyone, not even their own family if they show up on site. And they don't stick around. We've tried keeping them longer for questioning. They don't talk much, and what they do say is vague, at best. They leave on the pilgrimage flight, and once they're gone, that's it. We don't know where they go, and frankly, it's better that way." As Morgan continued to brief him, James couldn't shake the strange feeling that there was more to this place. The unsettling calm, the rigid efficiency of the personnel, the way no one seemed to question the absurdity of a plane appearing out of nowhere every year with passengers that claimed to be reincarnated. His rational mind fought to make sense of it, but the deeper part of him, the part that had always been fascinated by the unknown, was drawn to the mystery. The more he heard, the more curious he became. "What happens if something goes wrong?" James asked after a moment of silence. "Wrong," Morgan gave him a half smile. "Nothing ever goes wrong. Or at least, not in a way you can stop. You just follow procedure, watch, and wait. That's how you survive here. James felt a cold chill run down his spine. It was as though Morgan was warning him that survival, not understanding, was the priority. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he signed up for the SCP Foundation, but this was certainly not it. The thrill of working with something unknown had been appealing, but now, standing in the midst of it, he realized how out of his depth he truly was. "You're not the first to have doubts, James," Morgan said, reading his expression. "Everyone's skeptical when they first get here. Hell, I was. But when you see that plane touch down tomorrow, with no crew and no explanation, you'll stop trying to rationalize it. Just do your job and you'll be fine." James swallowed hard. There was something about Morgan's tone that didn't sit well with him, but he nodded anyway. Got it. As the day went on, James met the rest of the orientation class. Most of them were younger, fresh out of university, and like him, eager to make their mark in the Foundation. They tried to stay upbeat, but the looming event of September 23rd weighed heavily on their conversations. Rumors circulated, stories about past orientations where people had gone missing, though no one could prove it. James kept quiet, observing the others, wondering if any of them felt the same gnawing anxiety that he did. As night fell, James found himself standing alone on the runway, staring into the vast emptiness. The air was still hot, but the darkness brought a new kind of chill. He knew the arrival flight would be here in just a few hours. The idea of meeting these pilgrims, of seeing a plane land with no apparent crew, left him with a deep sense of unease. And yet beneath that unease, there was something else. A sense of anticipation, a thrill at the thought of witnessing the impossible. The file on SCP-036 had only scratched the surface, and now, standing here at Site 22A, James was on the verge of seeing it for himself. Whatever happened next, he wasn't sure if he would be ready. But there was no turning back now. The meeting room was dimly lit, casting long shadows on the faces of those gathered around the table. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and dust, and despite the buzz of the overhead projector, a quiet unease hung over the room. James sat near the back, watching as the senior members of the Foundation reviewed the upcoming events of the 23rd. They seemed calm, almost indifferent, as if this was nothing more than a routine briefing. For them, maybe it was. For James, it was something far stranger. On the screen, a map of the area flickered into focus. Site 22 sat at the center, a lonely dot in the otherwise barren landscape of northern Iraq. The map showed the surrounding villages, the airstrip, and a stretch of desert leading to the coordinates of Site 22 billion, the place no one ever spoke of in detail. Site 22A has been operational since the early 1960s, one of the senior officers, Dr. Renner, began, his voice low and steady. And the Foundation took over from local authorities after strange reports surfaced regarding annual arrivals at this airport. So we now understand these to be the pilgrims, Yazidi individuals who died in the previous year, allegedly undergoing the Kiras Gahoran. Renner paused, flipping through a few old photographs on the screen, blurry images of men and women disembarking from planes, their expressions blank, their eyes glassy. They looked like ordinary people, but there was something off, something deeply unsettling about their stillness. The arrival flight appears without warning, Renner continued, his tone betraying no hint of emotion, no communication, no identification on radar. It's always different, a different model, sometimes a different make, but it's always the same in its purpose. The pilgrims land, they enter the terminal, they wait. James found his mind drifting as Renner spoke. He had heard some of this in his initial briefing, but now, seeing the faces of the pilgrims, his stomach tightened. The pilgrims, according to the reports, had been dead for months, sometimes longer. They were identified through birth certificates, fingerprints, and photo IDs, all of which matched perfectly with individuals who had died under normal circumstances. They weren't ghosts. They weren't something out of a horror movie. They were real people, flesh and blood, returned from the grave for reasons no one fully understood. James couldn't shake the image of those pilgrims in the photographs, their vacant expressions, their unsettling calm. Something about the way they stood, as if they were waiting for something, gave him a sense of dread. What were they waiting for? Most of the pilgrims, Renner continued, cannot remember their past lives. They don't recognize family members. When questioned, they speak in vague terms, often describing their journey as necessary but providing little else. We don't push too hard. It never ends well when we do. That last sentence lingered in the room like a bad omen. James glanced around the table. The other recruits, much like him, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one spoke, but the unease was palpable. Morgan, who had been standing by the doorway, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Let's talk about the Kira's Gehorin," he said, his tone more casual than Renner's, but no less unsettling. "This is what the pilgrims claim to be experiencing, a kind of reincarnation ritual. They are returning from the dead to prepare for another life. The Yazidi people have practiced symbolic versions of this for centuries, but what we're dealing with here is, well, the real deal, we think." James felt a chill. The real deal. Reincarnation wasn't something he had ever seriously considered. It was a philosophical idea, a belief system for some, but this was different. This was happening. Morgan continued, leaning casually against the wall. "The thing about the Kira's Gehorin is we don't know why it happens here, or why these particular pilgrims are chosen. The Yazidi themselves don't talk about it openly, not even to us. All we know is that these individuals are drawn here, to this airport, at this time of year. They're friendly enough, but don't let that fool you. We've lost good people trying to keep them from their pilgrimage flight." James caught that last part. Lost people. Morgan glanced at him, his expression tightening. "Yeah, lost. Some agents thought they could detain the pilgrims, hold them back for questioning. They vanished. Gone without a trace. No one knows where they went. So follow protocol, do your job, and don't interfere with the process. It's for your own safety." James swallowed hard, his unease deepening. There was a lot left unsaid, a lot that he wasn't being told. And yet, he couldn't stop his mind from racing with possibilities. Where did the pilgrims go? What happened to the agents who vanished? Was there something else at play here, something darker, more dangerous? As the briefing continued, Renner went over the technical details of the monitoring equipment. James listened, but his mind kept drifting back to the pilgrims, to their empty eyes and vague, cryptic words. What would he see when that plane touched down tomorrow? What would those passengers be like up close? Before he knew it, the meeting was over, and the room began to clear out. James stood, still processing everything he had heard. As the others filed out, Morgan approached him, a grim look on his face. "The first time doing something like this, huh?" Morgan asked, his voice softer now, less commanding. James nodded. "Yeah, it's a lot to take in." Morgan clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm. "It's normal to feel like that. You just don't let it get to you. We all have our first time with this stuff, and it never gets easier, but you'll get through it." James forced a smile. "I hope so." Morgan gave him a small nod before heading toward the door. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Get some rest tonight." As James made his way back to the small barracks they had set up for the new recruits, his mind raced with questions. The idea of pilgrims returning from the dead felt too surreal to accept, and yet, in a matter of hours, he would see it for himself. The skepticism that had once protected his rational mind was eroding fast, replaced by a gnawing curiosity. He lay down in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, trying to quiet the thoughts swirling in his head, but sleep didn't come easily. Instead, his mind drifted to the faces of those pilgrims, and the question that haunted him most: what did they see on their journey, and why did it feel like something more than just a ritual of reincarnation? As the night stretched on, that unsettling mystery gnawed at him, growing heavier with each passing minute. Tomorrow, the answers would come. But James wasn't sure if he was ready to face them. The barracks were a quiet hum of nervous energy as James and the rest of the orientation class gathered in the common area. It was September 23rd, the night they had all been briefed about, the night the arrival flight was expected. Despite the hushed murmurs and forced smiles, tension hovered in the room like a thick fog. No one said it outright, but the unease was palpable. James sat on the edge of a worn couch, his hands resting on his knees, listening to the others exchange half-hearted jokes and stories. A young woman named Claire, who had been the most vocal in the days leading up to this, was trying to keep the mood light. "So you guys think these pilgrims are going to be, like, actual ghosts?" she asked, her tone teasing, but her eyes betrayed her nerves. A few people chuckled, though it was thin and hollow. James gave her a faint smile but said nothing. He could feel his pulse in his neck, a steady reminder of the unknown awaiting them. The briefing they had received left too many gaps. What the senior staff hadn't said was just as unsettling as what they had. The pilgrims weren't ghosts, but they weren't exactly alive either. That much was clear. And sitting across from him, a guy named Harris leaned forward, his arms resting on his knees, looking around at the others. "Though I don't care if they're ghosts or reincarnated saints," he said with a grin. "As long as they don't get in my face, I'm good." More nervous laughter followed, though everyone knew the levity wouldn't last. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a deep orange glow over the desert. Soon the arrival flight would be here, and all the joking in the world couldn't change that. James felt the weight of the silence growing between the words. He ran his hand through his hair, trying to focus. They had a job to do, but the creeping anxiety that filled the room was making it hard to think clearly. The reality of what they were about to witness loomed large in his mind. "All right," Harris said, clapping his hands together. "Let's get this over with. Maybe it won't be as bad as we think, right?" James glanced out the window, watching the last slivers of daylight fade behind the horizon. The night was closing in, and with it something else, something they couldn't see yet, but that was steadily approaching. It wasn't long before the quiet was broken. A voice crackled over the intercom. "All personnel to the observation room. We have movement on radar." James stood, his stomach tightening. The others followed, filing out of the common area and down the narrow hallway toward the observation room. The sound of footsteps echoed off the cold concrete walls, their pace quickening with every step. The weight of anticipation pressed down on them all. When they arrived, the room was already alive with activity. Senior staff stood around the radar screen, staring intently at the green blips that moved slowly across the display. The light cast a faint glow over their faces, making them appear ghostly in the dim room. James took a spot near the back, watching as the radar technician adjusted the controls. "We've got an unidentified plane approaching from the east," she said, her voice steady but tense. "No flight plan, no clearance. It's the arrival flight." A murmur spread through the room. The tension ratcheted up several notches, and James could feel the electric crackle of fear beneath the surface. 30 kilometers out, the technician reported. Speed and altitude are consistent with previous years. James swallowed hard. It was happening. Everything they'd been told to expect, everything that had been vague and distant until now, was suddenly real. His palms were slick with sweat as he gripped the edge of the table in front of him. The senior staff remained calm, as if this was all just routine for them. But for James and the rest of the orientation class, it was anything but. He could see the unease in their faces, the way Claire was fidgeting with her sleeves, the way Harris kept clenching and unclenching his fists. This wasn't some exercise. This was real. 15 kilometers, the technician said, her voice lower now. And the room seemed to grow colder as the plane drew nearer, as if the temperature itself had dropped with its approach. James felt the shiver crawl down his spine, his breath coming in shallow bursts. His thoughts raced, a chaotic swirl of questions and uncertainty. And what were they about to see? What were these pilgrims, really? Suddenly, the radar technician glanced at the senior officers, her brow furrowing. "Something's off," she said. "The plane, it's not responding to any signals. No transponder, just like the report said." Dr. Renner, who had been watching silently from the corner, nodded. "That's normal. It won't respond." Normal. James couldn't help but feel that nothing about this situation was normal. The minutes stretched on like hours. The silence in the room became almost unbearable. So everyone watched the radar, waiting, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. And then, finally, the technician spoke again. "We have visual contact." James's heart leaped into his throat as the large monitor flickered, showing a grainy black and white image of the approaching plane. It was distant at first, a tiny dot in the night sky, growing larger with each passing second. And there were no lights, no identifiers, nothing to indicate where it had come from. It was just a shadow moving across the screen, dark and foreboding. The air in the observation room was heavy with anticipation. James could feel it, the way everyone around him seemed to hold their breath in unison. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the monitor. "There it is," the technician whispered, as if speaking any louder would disturb the plane's ghostly arrival. The plane came into full view now, a sleek, almost featureless aircraft. It didn't look like any commercial plane James had ever seen. There was no logo, no markings on its hull. It was like a void in the sky, an absence rather than a presence. "It'll land soon," Morgan said quietly, standing just behind James. "And then the real fun begins." James glanced at him, but Morgan's face was unreadable. As the plane descended toward the runway, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The reality of the situation settled in, and a deep, gnawing fear took hold of James's chest. He could feel it, a sense that something was terribly wrong, something beyond their understanding. The plane was just the beginning. The arrival flight was here. And with it, the mystery that would change everything. The rumble of the plane's landing reverberated through the observation room, sending a ripple of anxiety through the team. James stood by the window, watching as the unidentified aircraft touched down on the runway with a precision that felt almost unnatural. The plane was sleek and silent, its landing smooth, as if it had done this 1,000 times before. No clearance, no radio communication, just a ghostly arrival in the dead of night. As it rolled to a stop, James's eyes were drawn to the cockpit, where he caught a glimpse of the pilots. Both figures wore masks, blank, expressionless coverings that obscured their faces entirely. They moved with mechanical precision, their gestures too rehearsed, too calm. The sense of unease that had been simmering since the briefing now boiled to the surface. The pilots made no move to exit the plane, no acknowledgement of the personnel waiting outside. They were simply there like shadows waiting in silence. "James, let's go," Morgan's voice cut through his thoughts. James followed the rest of the orientation team outside, stepping onto the cold tarmac. The night air was still, but it carried a strange heaviness, as though something unseen pressed down on them. The rest of the staff had gathered around the plane, standing at a distance as the door slowly opened with a low hiss. For a moment, everything was silent, save for the soft hum of the plane's engines. And then, they began to emerge. The pilgrims stepped out one by one, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were unsure of where they were or why they were there. James watched them closely, his heart pounding in his chest. Each pilgrim wore traditional Yazidi garb, but their faces were what unsettled him the most. Their expressions were distant, vacant, like they were seeing something far beyond the world around them. There was no fear in their eyes, no recognition of the people waiting to greet them, just a chilling sense of detachment. As they moved down the steps, one of the senior officers, Dr. Renner, approached them cautiously. The Foundation had done this many times before, and yet, every year, the arrival felt no less strange. "Welcome," Renner began, his voice steady. "We're here to help you with your pilgrimage. If you'll follow us inside, we'd like to ask you a few questions before your journey continues." The pilgrims didn't respond, but they followed obediently, their faces betraying no emotion. James found himself instinctively hanging back, watching as they were led into the terminal building. Something about the way they moved made his skin crawl. It wasn't that they were aggressive or dangerous, but there was an unnatural calm to them, like they weren't fully present. As the last of the pilgrims entered the terminal, James caught sight of the masked pilot still seated in the cockpit. The pilot remained motionless, hands gripping the controls, staring straight ahead. James couldn't shake the feeling that the pilot was more than just a faceless figure, that behind the mask there was something watching, something aware of them all. He wanted to look away, but his eyes were glued to the figure, the growing sense of unease tightening around him like a noose. Morgan tapped his shoulder, breaking the spell. "Don't stare too long," he muttered. "Those pilots have been in that cockpit for years. No one knows why they never leave." James nodded, though the unease lingered. He followed Morgan into the terminal, where the questioning had already begun. The pilgrims sat in a line, their eyes focused on nothing in particular. One of the senior agents, a woman named Dr. Reyes, was conducting the interviews, though the process seemed more like a formality than an actual interrogation. "Can you tell us your name?" Reyes asked one of the pilgrims, a middle-aged man with graying hair. The pilgrim blinked, his gaze distant. "My name? I think it was. I don't remember." His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. "And where are you from?" she pressed. "From somewhere far." It doesn't matter anymore. Only the pilgrimage matters. Reyes exchanged a look with Renner, then continued. Do you remember your family? Where you lived? How you got here? The pilgrim's eyes flickered briefly with something like confusion, but it faded almost instantly. No, none of that is important. I am here to go on the pilgrimage. James watched the exchange, a knot of dread twisting in his gut. Each pilgrim answered the same way, detached, distant, unable to recall any personal details. It was as if they had left their past lives behind completely, driven only by the singular need to complete this pilgrimage, whatever it was. What happens on the pilgrimage? James asked Morgan quietly, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Morgan shrugged, his expression tight. We don't know. They board the pilgrimage flight and disappear. No one's ever come back, and the data we collect doesn't make sense. Missing time, distorted recordings, it's like they're leaving this reality entirely. James felt a cold sweat break out along his skin. The whole situation was starting to feel more surreal by the second. These pilgrims weren't just people on a journey, they were something else, something caught between life and death, memory and oblivion. As the interviews continued, one of the pilgrims, a woman no older than her 20s, turned her head slightly, her eyes locking onto James. For a moment, her gaze seemed to sharpen, focusing on him in a way that made his breath catch. There was recognition in her eyes, but it wasn't the kind of recognition that came from knowing someone. It was deeper, more unsettling, as though she saw something in him that he couldn't see in himself. The pilgrimage is important, she said softly, as if speaking directly to him. It's the only way. James stiffened, unsure how to respond. The air around them felt heavy, like the walls themselves were closing in. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. That's enough for now, Dr. Renner cut in, stepping between them. We'll continue the questions tomorrow before the pilgrimage flight departs. The pilgrims didn't protest. They simply stood and began filing out of the room, their steps eerily synchronized. The weight of their presence lingered long after they were gone. As James stood there, the silence felt oppressive. The mystery of these pilgrims and the unsettling ritual they were part of gnawed at him. He had signed up for this job knowing it would be strange, but nothing had prepared him for this. The quiet horror of the unknown, the feeling that something far bigger was happening, just beyond his understanding. And in the distance, beyond the terminal windows, the masked pilot still waited in the cockpit, staring into the night. James stared at the blinking cursor on his tablet, watching the seconds tick by as he recorded the latest data from the pilgrim's arrival. The night had grown colder, the quiet stillness outside almost unbearable. The eerie silence of Site 22A was punctuated only by the distant hum of the arrival flight, still parked on the runway, its masked pilot unmoving. It was well past midnight, and the pilgrims had been settling in for several hours, quietly preparing for the pilgrimage flight that would take them to Site 22 billion. Everything had felt off since their arrival, but James couldn't quite put his finger on why. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken yet undeniably present. As he reviewed the video footage from earlier in the night, his stomach knotted. Something was wrong. The timestamps didn't match what he remembered. He scrubbed through the footage, his brow furrowed in confusion. A full 15 minutes were missing from the recording. Did I forget to hit record? James muttered to himself, though the nagging doubt in his mind told him otherwise. He could clearly recall starting the camera, watching as the pilgrims disembarked, but now the video was inexplicably fragmented. Entire sections skipped forward, as if they had never happened at all. He glanced around the observation room. Harris was sitting across from him, nervously tapping his fingers on the desk. Claire had her head in her hands, staring at the floor as though trying to make sense of something. The rest of the orientation team looked similarly unsettled, each of them lost in their own thoughts. They'd been briefed on the anomalies surrounding the pilgrimage flight, but James hadn't expected them to be this disorienting. "Hey, did you guys notice anything weird with the footage?" James asked, trying to break the tense silence. Harris looked up, frowning. What do you mean? James gestured to his tablet. I'm missing about 15 minutes of video. And I don't mean I forgot to record. It's like it was just erased. Claire lifted her head, blinking as if trying to pull herself out of a fog. Yeah, I noticed something like that earlier. I was taking notes, and suddenly I couldn't remember writing half of them. I thought I was just tired, but... Stress, probably, Harris said, though his voice lacked conviction. This whole thing is messing with our heads. It's got to be the pressure. James nodded, but the explanation didn't sit right. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that this wasn't just stress. Something about the way time had slipped by, unnoticed, made his skin crawl. As the hours passed, the strange occurrences only multiplied. James tried to focus on his tasks, but his mind kept wandering back to the gaps. Time felt slippery, as if it was sliding past him without his awareness. One moment he would be documenting the pilgrims' behavior, and the next, half an hour had disappeared without explanation. At first, he tried to brush it off. The Foundation had warned them about the strange effects that sometimes accompanied the pilgrims' presence. Missing time wasn't unheard of, they had said. But this was something different. It was disorienting in a way that made James feel untethered, as if reality itself was fraying at the edges. The other members of the orientation team began to exhibit similar symptoms. Harris had started mumbling under his breath, losing track of conversations mid-sentence. Claire seemed jumpy, her eyes darting to the clock every few minutes, as though she didn't trust it to tell the right time. Even Morgan, usually so unflappable, was pacing restlessly near the window, his face lined with unease. Then came the flickers. James was in the middle of reviewing the latest data from the radar when the lights in the room dimmed for just a second, long enough to make him freeze, his heart skipping a beat. He looked up, expecting to see the others react, but no one else seemed to notice. The lights returned to full brightness almost immediately, but the strangeness lingered. Did anyone else see that? James asked, his voice a little too sharp. Harris shook his head absently, barely paying attention. See what? The lights, James pressed. They just flickered. Claire rubbed her eyes. Maybe it's the power grid. It's an old place, right? Could be something electrical. James wanted to believe her, but deep down he knew better. It wasn't the lights, it was everything. The gaps in time, the missing footage, the way reality itself seemed to be twisting. He glanced at the pilgrims seated in the terminal. They hadn't moved in hours, their expressions blank and distant. But every now and then, James caught one of them looking at him, their eyes focused on him in a way that made his skin crawl. By the time dawn was creeping up on the horizon, the atmosphere at Site 22A had shifted completely. The air felt heavier, denser, as if the very fabric of time was warping. The pilgrims were stirring now, quietly preparing for the pilgrimage flight. James tried to ignore the pit forming in his stomach as they filed onto the tarmac, their movements as synchronized as they had been the night before. He continued documenting everything, but the sense of unreality wouldn't leave him. Each time he checked his notes or the footage, more gaps appeared. Entire conversations were missing, moments he vividly remembered simply. Gone. It was like pieces of the night had been erased, not just from the records but from his mind. Morgan approached him as the last of the pilgrims boarded the plane. "You look pale," he said, his voice low. "You okay?" James shook his head, rubbing his temple. "Something's wrong, Morgan. I can't account for all of the time that's passed. It's like things are just slipping away, and it's not just me. Everyone's experiencing it, but no one's talking about it." Morgan sighed, glancing at the plane. "This happens every year. The anomalies, the missing time, it's all part of the process. You just have to let it go. Trying to understand it will only drive you crazy." James looked at him, his stomach twisting with frustration. How are we supposed to just let it go? This is beyond anything we were told to expect. Morgan's eyes darkened. You weren't told everything because you don't need to know everything. Trust me, the less you think about it, the better. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was being withheld from them. The missing time, the strange behavior of the pilgrims, and the eerie presence of the masked pilots all pointed to something bigger, something the Foundation wasn't willing to share. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the runway, the pilgrimage flight finally prepared for takeoff. The plane's engines roared to life, and the pilgrims, now seated inside, remained as still as ever, their faces obscured behind the windows. James watched from a distance, his heart pounding in his chest. The plane began to roll forward slowly at first, and then picking up speed. And as it did, the air seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy, as if the very act of the plane's departure was tearing a hole in reality. And then, in an instant, it was gone, vanished into the sky, leaving only a lingering sense of emptiness behind. James stood there for a long time, staring at the empty runway, his thoughts spiraling. The pilgrimage flight was over, but the questions it had left behind were only just beginning. The days following the departure of the pilgrimage flight were a blur for James. The eerie calm that had settled over Site 22A was unnerving, as if the air itself carried a weight no one wanted to acknowledge. The constant hum of tension that had accompanied the pilgrims' arrival lingered, but the sense of relief James had expected after the plane left never came. Instead, a new, darker reality began to take hold. It started with Claire. James noticed her absence one morning as he entered the common area. At first, he assumed she had gone on an assignment, maybe conducting interviews or reviewing footage from the pilgrimage. But as the hours passed, and she still hadn't appeared, he asked Harris if he'd seen her. Claire? Harris rubbed his eyes, looking groggy. She didn't mention anything. Probably just taking some time to rest. You know how drained we've all been. But by midday, when she still hadn't turned up, James's unease deepened. The rest of the orientation class didn't seem too concerned, though they had their own distractions, strained faces, dark circles under their eyes. The weight of exhaustion and anxiety them down. James checked the logs and found no record of Claire being reassigned or leaving the base. That night, over dinner, James brought it up to Morgan. Morgan, have you seen Claire today? She's been missing since the morning. Morgan didn't look up from his plate. She's been reassigned. James felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. Reassigned? When? There's nothing in the logs about it. Morgan's eyes finally met James's, but there was no concern in them. It's routine. People get reassigned all the time. You don't need to worry about it. James wanted to push further, but something in Morgan's tone silenced him. Routine. That word repeated in his mind like an echo. But this didn't feel routine. This felt like something was being hidden, swept under the rug. The next day, Harris was gone. At first, James thought he might have missed him during the morning shift change. But as the hours ticked by, it became clear that Harris had vanished as well. When James confronted Morgan again, the answer was the same. Harris had been reassigned. You're telling me 2 of my colleagues were reassigned in the span of 2 days, and no one thought to tell the rest of us? James's frustration was boiling over now. Morgan's response was a flat, "It's above your clearance level. Focus on your tasks, James." That night, James couldn't sleep. The empty bunks where Claire and Harris once slept gnawed at him, filling him with an unsettling sense of dread. What was happening to his team? He replayed Morgan's words in his mind, but they didn't comfort him. Something was terribly wrong. As he lay awake staring at the ceiling, James began to feel a creeping sense of exhaustion overtaking him. Despite his best efforts to stay alert, sleep finally claimed him. And then came the dream. James found himself standing in a vast, desolate landscape, an endless expanse of cracked earth stretching out in all directions. The sky above was a dull gray, shifting and swirling with strange, unnatural patterns. In the distance, towering structures of stone and metal jutted out of the ground, their forms twisted and alien. He walked forward, though he didn't know why or where he was headed. His feet moved of their own accord, carrying him toward the distant horizon. The air was thick with heat and pressure, making it hard to breathe. As he moved closer to the structures, he saw shadowy figures standing at the base of each one. They were distant, but James could sense their gaze on him, watching him with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. Then, one of the figures stepped forward, its form becoming clearer. It was Claire, but something was wrong. Her eyes were empty, her face expressionless. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a soft, hollow whisper that echoed in James's ears. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. The dream had been so vivid, so real. He could still feel the oppressive weight of that alien landscape pressing down on him. James sat up, gasping for breath. He wasn't the only one experiencing this. Harris had mentioned vivid dreams just before he vanished, strange dreams of distant, unfamiliar places. And now, James was having them too. The next day, he overheard two more members of the orientation team whispering to each other, their voices hushed and filled with fear. One of them, a young man named Davis, was describing a dream similar to James's. An endless, barren landscape, unfamiliar structures, a feeling of being watched. James's pulse quickened. "You had the same dream?" he asked, approaching them. Davis glanced at him, wide-eyed. "Yeah, last night. I didn't think anyone else was having them." Before James could respond, Morgan's voice cut through the air. "All personnel, report to the observation room, now." The observation room felt colder than usual as the remaining members of the orientation team gathered. Morgan was waiting, his face as stoic as ever. "We've had some irregularities with personnel," Morgan began, his voice level. "As some of you have noticed, a few of your colleagues have been reassigned. This is standard protocol when anomalies occur." James felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. "What kind of anomalies, Morgan? You keep saying they've been reassigned, but where? Why haven't we been informed?" Morgan's gaze hardened. "I don't have to explain every decision to you, James. Focus on your duties." James opened his mouth to protest, but Morgan cut him off. "The dreams you've been having, that some of you have been having, they're part of the effects of SCP-36. The closer we get to the pilgrimage flight's return, the stronger the anomalies become. You're experiencing residual effects from the pilgrim's passage. It's harmless." "Harmless?" Davis's voice trembled. "People are disappearing. That doesn't feel harmless." Morgan remained calm. "No one is disappearing. They've been reassigned. You will not speak of this again." James clenched his fists, his mind racing. The senior staff were covering something up, he was sure of it. His team wasn't just being reassigned. They were vanishing, one by one, slipping away as if they'd never existed. And the dreams were the key. There was something more to them, something connected to the pilgrimage, to the land of the dead the pilgrims spoke of. As the briefing ended, James lingered behind, his thoughts swirling. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to get them from Morgan. That night, as he lay in bed, he felt the weight of exhaustion pull him into sleep once more, and once again he found himself standing in that alien landscape, the towering structures looming in the distance, the shadowy figures watching from afar. This time, though, one of the figures stepped closer, so close that James could see its eyes. So it was Harris, and he opened his mouth to speak, but instead of words, all James heard was a low, rumbling whisper, "You're next." James woke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, his mind reeling. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was taking his colleagues, something connected to SCP-36, to the dreams, to the pilgrims. And now, it was coming for him. The air at Site 22 felt unnaturally still on the evening of September 30th. James stood at the edge of the runway, his stomach churning as he watched the pilgrims silently prepare for the pilgrimage flight. Their movements were synchronized, almost mechanical, as they boarded the plane that would take them to the mysterious Site 22 billion. It was supposed to be a routine event, just another strange occurrence in the long list of SPEP phenomena, but the weight of recent events pressed down on James like a lead blanket. His colleagues, the orientation class he had trained with, were gone, vanished with nothing more than vague reassurances from Morgan and the senior staff. Reassigned, they called it. But James knew better. Something was terribly wrong, and the disquieting dreams of alien landscapes and strange figures were only the beginning. As the last of the pilgrims boarded the plane, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that couldn't be undone. The air itself seemed to be hung with tension, as if the very fabric of reality was waiting to unravel. Morgan stood nearby, his expression as unreadable as ever. "You're looking pale, James," he said, his voice low. "Nervous?" "Oz." James didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the boarding pilgrims. Their faces were blank, motionless, as they climbed the stairs to the plane. But one pilgrim, a woman dressed in simple, flowing robes, paused at the top of the stairs. She turned her head, locking eyes with James. Her gaze was piercing, and for the first time since the arrival of the pilgrims, James saw something behind the vacant expression. Awareness, a flicker of recognition. She stepped down from the stairs, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps. James felt a chill crawl up his spine as she approached, her face inches from his. The world around him seemed to fade, the noise of the airfield dimming, until all he could hear was the sound of his own breathing. "You," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Beware the land of the dead. Once you see it, you cannot return." James's heart raced, his skin tingling with fear. He tried to respond, but his throat was tight, and no words came out. The woman's gaze held us for a moment longer, her eyes dark and hollow, before she turned and rejoined the other pilgrims, disappearing into the plane. Morgan raised an eyebrow, clearly noticing the interaction, but saying nothing. The moment passed in a blur. The door of the plane closed, and the engines roared to life, their deep, guttural hum vibrating through the ground beneath James's feet. The pilgrimage flight was ready to depart, and with it, the last traces of the strange pilgrims. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, James's heart pounded in his chest. The cryptic warning from the pilgrim echoed in his mind. "Once you see it, you cannot return." What did she mean? Was it about the dreams? The land of the dead she had spoken of? Was it connected to the alien landscapes he and his missing colleagues had dreamed about? And he watched the plane take off, its dark silhouette climbing higher into the sky. The moment it disappeared beyond the horizon, James felt the weight of the mystery closing in. And something was wrong, more than just the disappearances, more than the dreams. There was a force at work, something deeper and more sinister than he had imagined. Back in the observation room, James reviewed the footage of the flight's departure, his fingers trembling slightly as he scrubbed through the VO. But as he stared at the screen, his stomach dropped. The data, everything from the moment the plane left the runway, was corrupted. The video feed was static, distorted with glitching frames that cut in and out, displaying random moments out of sequence. The radar data was similarly scrambled, with entire sections missing or replaced with gibberish. James clicked through file after file, but each one showed the same thing: altered, incomplete, fragmented. His pulse quickened. How could this be? The equipment had been fine all night. It wasn't just a technical malfunction. This felt deliberate, like the data itself had been erased, rewritten by something he couldn't explain. He hurried to the terminal logs, hoping to find something, anything, that could give him a clue. But when he checked the personnel records, his blood ran cold. Claire's name was gone. And so was Harris's, and Davis's. Their records had been erased, as if they had never existed. The files James had seen just days ago, the logs that had recorded their every action, they were all gone, wiped clean from the system. There was no trace of them, no evidence they had ever been part of the orientation class. Panic surged through James. He quickly scrolled to his own name, his hands shaking. For now, he was still listed. But how long before he disappeared too? How long before he, like the others, was erased from existence, lost to whatever force was altering reality around them? James rushed to Morgan's office, barging through the door. "Morgan," he shouted, his voice thick with fear. "The data, it's gone. All of it. And so are the others. Their records are missing. This isn't normal. What's happening?" Morgan looked up from his desk, his face calm, almost bored. "James, I told you before. These things happen. The anomalies." "Anomalies?" "This isn't just an anomaly," James snapped. "People are disappearing. They're being erased like they never existed. You can't just brush this off as routine." Morgan stood, his expression hardening. "You're overreacting, James. This is part of the process. Things go missing. People get reassigned. You need to let it go." "Reassigned?" James laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call it? Because it looks more like they've been erased from reality." Morgan's eyes narrowed. "You're treading on dangerous ground, James. I suggest you stop digging before you get yourself into something you can't handle." James stared at him, his anger and fear swirling into a single burning knot in his chest. "You know something, don't you? You know what's really happening here." Morgan didn't respond, his silence more telling than any words. Without another word, James turned and stormed out of the office. His mind raced as he hurried down the corridor, his thoughts tangled in a chaotic mess, and he needed to find answers, and quickly, before he disappeared like the others, before his existence was wiped clean, just like the corrupted data. The one thought gnawed at him, lingering in the back of his mind: beware the land of the dead. Once you see it, you cannot return. What if that was where his colleagues had gone? What if that was where he was headed to? James didn't know. But whatever it was, he knew one thing for certain: the answers were waiting, and they were far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. James sat hunched over the dimly lit desk in his quarters, the soft glow of the computer screen the only light in the room. His heart raced as he scrolled through pages of old records, his fingers trembling as they clicked through file after file. The night was silent around him, but his mind buzzed with unease. Something was terribly wrong at Site 22A, and he was closer than ever to uncovering it. For hours he had pored over the limited access logs and personnel records, determined to find the truth about the disappearances. His colleagues, Claire, Harris, Davis, had been wiped from the system as though they had never existed. But that wasn't all. James had found traces, small, corrupted files buried deep in the archives, of other orientation teams from years past. Each year, new staff members arrived, and each year they vanished without a trace. The common thread? Every disappearance was linked to the pilgrimage flight. James's fingers hesitated over the keyboard as he opened a document from 1993, one of the older reports he had managed to retrieve. The language was vague, almost deliberately obscured, but the pattern was clear. The names of missing personnel were scrubbed from official records, the explanations reduced to one phrase reassigned. But there was more. Hidden deep in the report was a description of symptoms, staff members complaining of vivid, disorienting dreams involving strange landscapes, just like the ones James and his team had experienced. The dreams seemed to start shortly after the pilgrimage flight and grew more intense until the individuals in question simply disappeared. James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. Every piece of evidence he found only confirmed what he had feared. Site 22A wasn't just a place for observing the oddities of SCP-36. It was a trap, one that lured in fresh recruits each year, only for them to be consumed by the same mystery they had been sent to monitor. His mind raced with the cryptic warning the pilgrim woman had given him: beware the land of the dead. Once you see it, you cannot return. What was the land of the dead? The dreams, the visions, were they glimpses of this otherworldly place? The quiet hum of the computer broke the stillness as James opened another file. This one dated back to 1972. It detailed an entire team of researchers who had been assigned to Site 22 for a special study of SCP-36. The initial reports were routine, until they weren't. A few weeks after the pilgrimage flight, personnel began vanishing, one by one. By the time the year was over, there was no one left from the original team. James felt his pulse quicken as he scrolled through the final pages of the report. The last entry was chilling. All attempts to locate missing personnel have failed. The consensus among senior staff is that the disappearances are tied to the anomalies surrounding Site 22 billion. Further investigation is not recommended. The risk of personnel loss is too high. The words blurred on the screen as James's eyes darted over them again and again. Site 22 billion, of course, the hidden location. No one had ever managed to reach it, but every year, the pilgrims boarded the plane and flew there. No one returned, and no data ever provided a clear picture of what lay beyond. The cameras on the plane malfunctioned, the flight logs were corrupted, nothing came back intact. James leaned back in his chair, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together in his mind. Site 22 billion wasn't just a destination, it was something else, something far more sinister. And the people who disappeared, were they taken there? He suddenly remembered something Morgan had said in passing, something about a task force that had once attempted to reach Site 22 billion on foot. The report on that attempt was redacted in the records James had access to, but the implication was clear. Communication had been lost, and the team had never been heard from again. James clicked open another window and began searching for any mentions of Site 22 billion. He found several scattered references, each one cryptic, and alluded to something ancient, something connected to the Yazidi beliefs in reincarnation and the Kiras-Kuhoran, the changing of garments. It was as though the place existed outside of normal time and space, an in-between world where the souls of the dead lingered, waiting for something. His heart raced as he dug deeper, but every answer he found only led to more questions. How could a place like Site 22 billion exist? A destination that no one could reach but somehow continued to draw in these pilgrims year after year. The chilling reality set in. Site 22 wasn't just a containment site for SCP-36. It was a gateway to something far more dangerous. James felt the cold sweat break out across his skin as he turned away from the screen. His head was spinning, and the nagging fear that had settled in his chest days ago was now a full-blown panic. The disappearances, the dreams, the corruption of data, all of it was tied to Site 22 billion. Every year, new staff arrived, and every year, some were lost. But why? What was the purpose of this cycle? As he paced the room, his thoughts spinning, he realized he had to find Morgan. He had to confront him about everything. The senior staff knew more than they were letting on, and James was done with their cryptic warnings and half-truths. He rushed through the dim corridors of the site, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached Morgan's office, he didn't bother knocking. The door swung open with a creak, and there sat Morgan, staring at a file on his desk, his expression as calm as ever. "Morgan," James said, his voice tight with frustration. "You need to tell me what's really happening here." Morgan glanced up at him, his face unreadable. "James, I already told you." "Don't give me that reassignment crap again," James snapped. "I've read the reports. I know about the disappearances, the dreams. This isn't just some routine anomaly. People are being wiped out of existence, and I'm not going to let it happen to me." Morgan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You've been digging, haven't you?" James stepped forward, his fists clenched. "What's really going on, Morgan? What is Site 22 billion? And what does it have to do with the disappearances?" Morgan was silent for a moment, his eyes studying James carefully. Then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "Site 22 billion is a place we don't fully understand. It's not just another location, it's something else, something connected to the Yazidi beliefs. The land of the dead, they call it." James felt his stomach twist. The land of the dead. Morgan nodded. Every year, the pilgrims board that plane and head to Site 22 billion. And every year, some of us get too close to the truth and disappear. The truth is, James, Site 22 billion isn't just a place. It's a threshold. Those who see it, those who touch it, they're drawn into it. And once you're pulled in, you can't come back. James's mind reeled. So my team, they're gone because they got too close. Morgan nodded again, his face grim. They saw too much. And now you're getting close too. James's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. The dreams, the missing time, the corrupted data, it was all tied to Site 22 billion. And now he was standing on the edge of the same fate. The land of the dead was calling. And James wasn't sure he had the strength to resist it. The interior of the reconnaissance plane hummed with a low, steady vibration as it cut through the early morning sky. James sat in the back, his heart pounding in his chest. His decision to sneak aboard the next flight heading to Site 22 billion had been impulsive, but he was beyond caring about protocol. The disappearances, the cryptic warnings, the dreams, it all pointed to Site 22 billion as the key to unlocking the mystery. He needed answers, and this was his only chance to find them. The other personnel on the plane, a mix of senior agents and technicians, were preoccupied with their instruments, preparing for the flight's approach to the elusive site. James had slipped aboard, hiding himself in the cramped storage compartment near the back of the plane. No one had noticed him yet, and he intended to keep it that way. As they neared Site 22 billion, the plane began to descend. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted, the once routine flight growing tense as the crew adjusted their instruments. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "We're about 30 kilometers out from Site 22 billion. Be advised, comms and instrumentation have been unreliable in this area. Stay sharp." James felt a growing unease in his gut. This was it, the place that had haunted his dreams, that had claimed his colleagues. He braced himself, peering out of the small porthole in the storage compartment. Below, the barren desert stretched out endlessly, but in the distance, a strange distortion shimmered on the horizon. As the plane drew closer, the first anomaly hit. The radio crackled violently before cutting out entirely. The pilot's voice faltered for a moment before falling silent. The cabin lights flickered. The technicians scrambled to stabilize their equipment, but the displays showed static, and the radar screen began glitching uncontrollably. "Instrumentation failure," someone muttered. "Losing all data feeds." James held his breath as the plane pushed forward through the distortion. Outside, the sky seemed to warp, the heat radiating from the desert below creating a surreal mirage that made the horizon blur and shift. For a moment, it was as though the fabric of reality itself was bending. And then he saw it. Site 22 billion materialized in the distance, a small, forgotten airport tucked into the landscape like a hidden scar. But that wasn't what caught James's attention. Standing at the edge of the runway was a massive stone figure, its ancient form looming over the site like a silent sentinel. The figure was impossible to miss, towering, impossibly old, and carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer in the heat. Its features were worn down, but the power of its presence was undeniable. James's breath caught in his throat. The stone figure appeared almost alive, as if it was watching them, waiting for something. The air around it wavered with heat, creating a mirage-like distortion that made it difficult to focus on any one detail. It felt as though the figure didn't belong in this world. It was ancient, otherworldly, a monument to something long forgotten. The plane shuddered violently, snapping James back to reality. "Stabilize." "Stabilize," the pilot shouted, his voice crackling through the failing intercom. The plane wobbled, the instruments failing to give any clear readings. The closer they got to Site 22 billion, the more distorted everything became. The ground below flickered, and for a moment James thought he saw the stone figure move, as though it had shifted its gaze toward the plane. Sweat poured down his face as the sense of wrongness grew. The further they ventured into this space, the less reality seemed to function the way it should. Time felt slippery, and his vision swam as he tried to keep his focus on the massive stone figure. But each time he blinked, it seemed to change, its form becoming both clearer and more indistinct at once, as though it existed in multiple realities. Suddenly, the pilot's voice broke through the haze. "We're losing altitude. We need to pull out." James clutched the sides of his seat as the plane lurched, beginning a sharp ascent to escape whatever force was pulling them down. The instruments remained blank, completely useless, and the radio was nothing but static. The heat from the desert below radiated through the hull of the plane, adding to the growing sense of disorientation. And then, without warning, the distortion around Site 22 billion intensified. For a split second, James felt as if the plane had crossed over into something else, a place that wasn't quite real, where the sky turned a deep, unnatural shade of red and the air buzzed with a strange, humming energy. The stone figure at the edge of the runway loomed larger, its shadow stretching impossibly far. He felt its presence in his bones, a deep, primal awareness that chilled him to his core. Then, Just as quickly, it was gone. The plane rocketed upward, breaking free from the invisible grip that had threatened to drag it down. The crew scrambled to regain control, and within moments, the distortion began to fade. The radio crackled back to life, and the instruments slowly flickered back online, though they were still far from reliable. James sat frozen in place, his heart hammering in his chest. The stone figure was now a distant memory, the desert below returning to its normal, barren state. But the brief glimpse of Site 22 billion, of that ancient figure standing watch over the forgotten runway, had shaken him to his core. They barely made it back to Site 22A. Back on the ground, the team disembarked quickly, their faces pale and drawn. No one spoke, the tension hanging heavy in the air. James slipped out of the plane unnoticed, his mind racing with what he had just seen. The stone figure, the distortions, the sense of being pulled into another reality, it all pointed to something much larger than any of them had imagined. Site 22 billion wasn't just an airport. It was a gateway, a place where the boundaries between life and death, reality and unreality, were thin and fragile. James knew now that the disappearances weren't just accidents. The people who had vanished had been pulled into that other place, drawn into whatever lay beyond Site 22 billion. And if the massive stone figure was any indication, they weren't coming back. As he walked away from the plane, the weight of what he had seen settled over him like a heavy shroud. The land of the dead, the ancient stone figure, the strange phenomena, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. Site 22 billion was far more dangerous than anyone had realized, and whatever was waiting there had its eyes on him now. James glanced back at the horizon, where the faint outline of the distant desert was barely visible. Somewhere out there, Site 22 billion stood, hidden in the folds of reality. He had come too close, seen too much. The land of the dead had noticed him, and it wasn't going to let him go easily. The night was heavy with anticipation, the air thick and oppressive as James sat alone in the empty barracks. The quiet was suffocating. He was the last one left. One by one, his colleagues had disappeared, wiped from the records, their existence erased as if they had never been at Site 22A. Claire, Harris, Davis, they were all gone, their faces now only memories that clung desperately to his fraying mind. He had tried to fight it, to make sense of the strange forces at play, but every attempt had been met with cryptic responses from his superiors. When he confronted Morgan earlier that day, demanding answers, the response had been the same as always, dismissive and vague. "It's all part of the process, James," Morgan had said, his face as cold as ever. "Don't get too involved." But how could he not? James knew what was coming. The pilgrimage flight was returning from Site 22 billion at dawn, and something told him that this would be his last night at Site 22A. Just like the others, he would vanish, become part of the cycle that claimed new recruits every year. The thought gnawed at him as he stared out of the window at the silent runway. There was no stopping it now. The pull of Site 22 billion was too strong. He could feel it, a strange sensation, like an invisible thread wrapped around his soul, tugging him toward the inevitable. The hours slipped away, and as dawn approached, a low rumble echoed through the stillness. James stood, his heart pounding in his chest as he made his way outside. The sky was a deep shade of blue, the first hints of light creeping over the horizon. And there, in the distance, the returning flight appeared, a dark, shadowy shape growing larger as it approached the runway. James's pulse quickened. He stood at the edge of the tarmac, watching as the plane descended, its landing smooth and silent, just like it had been before. The air around him felt thick, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The plane came to a stop, and for a moment, nothing happened. And then the door opened. A figure stepped out. It was the pilot, masked and faceless as ever. The figure moved with deliberate slowness, descending the stairs until it reached the ground. Without a word, it turned toward James, its blank face fixed on him. James's breath caught in his throat. There was no malice in the figure's stance, just an eerie stillness, a presence that seemed to stretch beyond the physical world. The figure raised a hand and gestured toward the plane. James felt his body tense. The gesture was clear, he was meant to board. But everything in him screamed to resist, to run as far from that plane as possible. Yet his feet remained rooted to the ground, as though the invisible thread had tightened, holding him in place. The masked figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just waited, patient and unmoving, its silent invitation hanging in the air between them. James tried to speak, to demand answers, but his voice failed him. His mind raced with the memories of the past few days, the disappearances, the dreams, the strange phenomena surrounding Site-22 billion. He had come too close to the truth, seen too much, and now it was time to pay the price. The world around him seemed to shift, the edges of reality blurring as if time itself had slowed. From the sky above, once a deep blue, now felt unreal, like a painted backdrop to a dream he couldn't escape. He blinked, and for a moment everything froze. The masked figure, the plane, the airfield, time itself seemed to stop. And then, without warning, James felt a powerful pull, like gravity had suddenly shifted. His body moved against his will, his feet dragging him forward. His legs felt numb, his arms heavy, as though he was moving through water. The masked figure remained still, watching as James walked toward the plane, step by step, unable to resist. His mind screamed, but his body betrayed him, drawn inexorably toward the waiting aircraft. As he neared the door, a cold dread settled over him. He knew, deep down, that once he boarded, there would be no return. The land of the dead, Site-22 billion, was calling him, just as it had called the others. James climbed the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. His movements were slow, mechanical, as though his body was no longer his own. The door to the plane stood open, and inside, the shadows seemed deeper, darker, inviting yet terrifying. As he reached the top of the stairs, he paused, his hand gripping the edge of the doorway, and he wanted to turn back, to resist whatever force was pulling him in. But the pull was too strong. He glanced over his shoulder one last time, looking out at the empty airfield, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. And then he stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the door closed behind him with a soft hiss, sealing him in. The interior of the plane was dark, the seats empty, but the presence of something unseen hung heavy in the air. James felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He was part of it now, part of the mystery, part of the cycle that had claimed so many before him. The plane began to move, its engines humming softly as it taxied down the runway. As the plane lifted into the air, James felt a strange calm settle over him. The world below grew smaller, fading into the distance, and soon there was nothing but the endless sky stretching out before him. The pull of Site-22 billion was stronger now, guiding the plane toward its final destination. James closed his eyes, letting go of the fear. The questions, the need for answers, the truth, he realized, was something he would never fully understand. He was part of the journey now, and there was no going back. As the plane disappeared into the horizon, the world below continued as it always had, unaware that yet another soul had been claimed by the land of the dead. And James was gone, swallowed by the mystery of Site-22 billion, lost to the world, just like the others, just like he had always known he would be.